Just as Darwinian evolution is the inspiration for my research, one of Darwin's most important influences was Thomas Malthus, an 18th century clergyman and scholar. I was reminded of Malthus recently as I discussed the market for rare diseases with some executives who work in that area. If you will allow me to digress for a moment into the science and the history, then I'll return to the practical implications of Malthus for pharma and medtech. Thomas Malthus's most famous work was a book called An Essay on the Principle of Population, and that book contained a key idea. Malthus thought that when we increase food production, we expect it to lead to improved standards of living. But in fact, its main effect is that population grows until that population outstrips its food supply, at which point the poorest in society starve. He was, of course, writing in the 18th century. Now, this Malthusian trap, as it became known, means that as we produce more, instead of a better fed society, we get the opposite result. Malthusian thinking influenced many Victorians, including Darwin, but his worst fears were not realised because technological developments that Malthus could not foresee, such as globalisation and industrial-scale food production, changed the course of history. But his logic persisted in the thinking of Darwin and others. Competition for limited resources is central to the concept of Darwinian evolution. So Malthus came to mind recently as I discussed a valuable report from Evaluate Pharma with some senior executives whose business model is focused on rare diseases. That report predicts that treatments for rare diseases will soon be 20% of the total pharmaceutical market. Now, as you might expect, the executives were very excited about this because it meant a bright future for them. At that point, however, I suggested that he needed to think about the Malthusian trap. Now, the parallel between today's pharmaceutical market and Malthus might not be obvious, so let me spell it out. The food on which the life sciences industry thrives is the money that governments and other payers allocate to healthcare. This is related ultimately to national income. In rich countries, there is enough money to pay for a good standard of basic healthcare and then to pay for some therapies that our ancestors would have considered expensive luxuries. These include many rare diseases whose outcomes, in health economic terms at least, are often much less good than other ways we could spend the same money, such as vaccination programs or disease prevention. In other words, the increasing wealth of rich countries has led to the growth of the number of conditions that we can treat and the number of business models focused on those rare diseases. This is directly analogous to Malthus's prediction that increased crop yields lead to higher populations. More money allows new business models to thrive, models that simply weren't and aren't viable in poor economies. So why is this analogy relevant to the pharma and medtech sector? Well, looked at from this perspective, it looks like there's a Malthusian trap lying ahead for those companies who have invested in rare diseases and other niche products, such as Takeda has with its recent acquisition of Shire. The attractiveness of rare diseases, orphan drugs and other multi-niche products, is that governments tolerate high cost per patient because the patients are relatively few in number. But if Evaluate Pharma are right and such treatments take up 20% of drug spend, then that toleration may not continue. It's easy to see governments limiting the benefits of orphan drug status, or starting to limit the prices paid for rare disease treatments. If that happens, the projections on which rare disease investments are premised may prove to be hopelessly optimistic. Of course, it is possible that unforeseen developments might save the day. Some people argue that the costs of specialised treatments may come down over time. They point to Moore's law in information technology as a model for this. But I think this is far too simplistic. You see, price decline depends on three things: economies of scale, on learning curves, and on competition. And unlike integrated circuits, rare disease markets aren't very susceptible to these forces. That's the nature of niche strategies. It is true that learning curves and other effects might drive down the costs somewhat, but my instinct tells me that small volume treatments will remain very expensive, in relative terms at least. And if their prices don't decline significantly, rare diseases, personalised therapies and other expensive niche treatments will grow to consume a disproportionate share of healthcare budgets. It's hard to imagine a scenario when such disproportionate growth in costs does not force payers to react. We might expect them to treat these specialist diseases much more like their cheaper cousins by applying cost-benefit analysis, for example. And if payers don't do that, it would inevitably lead, in Malthusian terms, to the starving of the lower classes of healthcare spend, such as elective procedures and therapies. Once that happens, a reaction against the funding of rare diseases seems inevitable. Malthus is often ignored because his worst fears weren't realised, but his logic was impeccable, and the idea of a Malthusian trap still makes sense. Life science companies who see rare diseases and specialty treatments as their future ought to consider this 200-year-old lesson.